December 21st, 1970. The most powerful man in the world sat in the Oval Office, staring at a letter written on American Airlines stationery. It was 6 pages long, rambling, handwritten in blue pen, and it came from Elvis Presley. The king of rock and roll wanted to meet the President of the United States, and he wanted something specific, a badge, a federal narcotics agent badge. Because Elvis Presley, at that very moment drowning in prescription pills, wanted to help fight the war on drugs. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But nobody in that room understood it yet. This is the story of Elvis's obsession with badges, his bizarre meeting with Richard Nixon, and the tragic contradiction that defined his final years. It started innocently enough. Maybe it always does. In the late 1960s, Elvis began collecting police badges. Not as a hobby, not as memorabilia, but as something deeper, something psychological. He would visit police departments in every city he toured, introduce himself, and ask for a badge. Honorary deputy, special officer, auxiliary patrolman. Whatever they would give him, he wanted it. And they gave it to him because he was Elvis, the king, the legend. But what they didn't understand was that Elvis wasn't collecting these badges because he thought they were cool. He was collecting them because they made him feel powerful, in control, like he had authority over something, anything. The first badge came from Memphis in 1968. Elvis walked into the police department and asked to meet the chief. When the chief came out, Elvis introduced himself, though everyone already knew who he was, and said he wanted to support law enforcement. He wanted to be part of the team. The chief, probably stunned and confused, gave him an honorary deputy badge. Elvis held it in his hands like it was made of gold. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up and said, "Thank you. This means more to me than you know." The chief laughed it off, but Elvis was serious, dead serious. That night, he showed the badge to everyone at Graceland. He pinned it to his jacket. He carried it in his pocket. And within weeks, he wanted more. By 1970, Elvis had badges from dozens of cities: Denver, Memphis, Las Vegas, Palm Springs. He kept them in special display cases at Graceland. He would take them out at night, alone in his room, and look at them, touch them, feel the weight of the metal, read the inscriptions. Deputy, Special Agent, Officer. These weren't just pieces of metal. They were proof that he mattered beyond the music, proof that he could be more than just an entertainer, proof that he had some kind of legitimate authority in a world that felt increasingly out of his control. Because by 1970, Elvis's life was chaos. His marriage to Priscilla was falling apart. His movie career was dead. His comeback was fading. And the pills, the pills were everywhere. Elvis's relationship with prescription medication had started in the army. Uppers to stay awake, downers to sleep, pain pills for injuries. It was all legal, all prescribed by doctors. That was important to Elvis. He wasn't a drug addict. Drug addicts took illegal drugs. Elvis took medicine. Medicine that doctors gave him. That made it okay. That made it controlled. That made it safe. Or so he told himself. But by 1970, Elvis was taking dozens of pills every day. Demerol, Dilaudid, Percodan, Placidil, Quaaludes, Valium, Dexedrine. The list went on and on. He had doctors on call, doctors who would prescribe whatever he wanted, doctors who were paid to say yes. And Elvis justified it all by saying, "It's medicine. It's legal. I'm not breaking any laws." Priscilla watched the badge obsession grow with increasing worry. She saw Elvis spending hours organizing his badge collection, polishing them, arranging them in display cases. One night in early December 1970, she found him at 3 a.m. sitting on the floor of his office at Graceland, surrounded by badges, talking to himself about which cities he still needed to visit to get more. She asked him, "Elvis, why does this matter so much to you?" He looked up at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Vulnerable, almost childlike. And he said, "Because when I wear these, I'm not just Elvis Presley the entertainer. I'm someone who matters, someone who protects people." Priscilla realized in that moment that the badges weren't about law enforcement. They were about identity, about trying to be something, anything, other than the person fame had turned him into. But what happened next would reveal the deepest contradiction of Elvis's life. In December 1970, Elvis got into an argument with his father, Vernon, and his wife Priscilla at Graceland. It was about money, about control, about Elvis feeling trapped in his own life. And in a moment of impulsive fury, Elvis grabbed his badge collection, his gun collection, and a few clothes, and walked out. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just left. He flew to Washington, D.C., because he had an idea. A crazy, desperate, impossible idea. He was going to meet President Nixon, and he was going to ask for the one badge that would make all the others meaningless. A federal narcotics agent badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. The ultimate badge. The ultimate authority. The ultimate proof that Elvis Presley was more than just a singer. On the plane to D.C., Elvis wrote a letter to President Nixon. 6 pages. Handwritten. Explaining who he was, as if Nixon didn't know, and explaining why he wanted to help fight the war on drugs. Elvis wrote about the youth of America being led astray by drug culture. He wrote about the Beatles and other rock musicians promoting drug use. He wrote about how he, Elvis Presley, as a patriotic American, wanted to serve his country by becoming a federal agent at large. He wanted to go undercover, to infiltrate the hippie drug scene, to save America's youth from the dangers of narcotics. The letter was sincere. Elvis believed every word. He saw himself as a hero, a protector, a force for good. The fact that he himself was addicted to prescription pills never entered his mind. Because those weren't drugs. Those were medicine. Elvis landed in Washington and went straight to the White House. Just showed up, walked up to the gate with his letter, and said he wanted to see the president. The Secret Service didn't know what to do with him. This was Elvis Presley. You couldn't just turn him away. So they took the letter. And incredibly, impossibly, Nixon's staff read it and thought, why not? Nixon was trying to connect with young people. Elvis was the biggest star in the world. A photo op with Elvis could help Nixon's image. So they called Elvis at his hotel and told him to come back. The president would see him, and this is where everything gets surreal. On December 21st, 1970, at 12:30 p.m., Elvis Presley walked into the Oval Office wearing a purple velvet suit, a gold belt with a massive buckle, amber-tinted sunglasses, and a cape. He looked like he had just walked off a Vegas stage, which in a way he had. President Richard Nixon, wearing a standard dark suit, stood up to greet him. The two most famous men in America, the king and the president, face to face, and Elvis immediately launched into his pitch. He talked about the drug problem. He talked about the Beatles. He talked about how he wanted to help. Nixon listened, bemused. This was the strangest meeting of his presidency. But he was intrigued. Elvis was passionate, sincere, clearly a little unhinged, but sincere. The meeting lasted about 30 minutes, though it felt longer to everyone in the room. H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, later wrote in his diary that watching Elvis and Nixon try to find common ground was like watching two people from different planets attempting communication. Elvis spoke in rapid bursts, jumping from topic to topic: drugs, youth culture, his badge collection, karate, his love of law enforcement. Nixon nodded along, occasionally interjecting with political talking points about law and order. At one point, Elvis reached into his pocket and pulled out a World War II-era Colt .45 pistol and handed it to Nixon as a gift. The Secret Service agents in the room nearly had heart attacks, but Nixon, to his credit, accepted it calmly and thanked Elvis. Then Elvis pulled out photos of his family and showed them to the president. Nixon looked at pictures of Priscilla and Lisa Marie and made polite small talk. It was surreal, absurd, and completely genuine on both sides. Then Elvis made his request. He wanted a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. He wanted to be a federal agent. Nixon looked at his aides. They looked at each other. And then, because this was the Nixon administration and nothing made sense anymore, they said yes. They called the Bureau. They arranged for a badge. And within hours, Elvis Aaron Presley was holding a gold federal narcotics agent badge in his hands. He stared at it like it was the Holy Grail. This was it, the ultimate badge, the proof he needed. He wasn't just a singer anymore. He was an agent. He had authority. He had control. He had power. But here's what nobody in that room understood. Here's the irony that would define the rest of Elvis's life. The man who now carried a federal narcotics badge, who claimed he wanted to fight drug abuse, was at that very moment carrying multiple prescription pills in his pockets. Demerol, Dilaudid, uppers, downers. He had taken pills that morning. He would take pills that afternoon. He would take pills every day for the rest of his life. And when he died 7 years later, on August 16, 1977, it would be from a drug overdose. Not illegal drugs, not street drugs, but prescription medications. The same medications he thought were safe because doctors prescribed them. The same medications he never considered drugs at all. Elvis left the White House that day feeling triumphant. He flew back to Memphis and immediately showed everyone his new badge, the federal agent badge. The badge that meant he was more than just Elvis. He was Special Agent Elvis Presley. He told his friends in the Memphis Mafia that he now had the authority to carry any gun, anywhere in the country, that he could go undercover, that he could arrest people if he needed to. Was any of this true? Not really. The badge was largely ceremonial, a goodwill gesture from Nixon's staff to a celebrity. But to Elvis, it was everything. It was validation. It was purpose. It was proof that he mattered beyond the music. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's close-knit group of friends and bodyguards, had mixed reactions to the badge. Some of them thought it was funny, a surreal moment they'd tell as a story for years to come. But others, like Jerry Schilling and Red West, saw something darker. They saw Elvis's eyes when he talked about the badge, the intensity, the desperation. They realized this wasn't just Elvis being eccentric. This was Elvis clinging to something because he was drowning and he needed a life raft. And the badge, this piece of metal from the government, had become that life raft. Red West later said, "When Elvis got that federal badge, I knew we were in trouble, because it gave him permission to believe his own lies." Wait a minute. Don't miss this detail. Elvis's obsession with badges wasn't just about power or control. It was about identity. Because by 1970, Elvis didn't know who he was anymore. Was he still the rebel from the 1950s? The movie star from the 1960s? The Vegas performer? The comeback king? He had played so many roles, worn so many costumes, become so many versions of himself, that the real Elvis, whoever that was, had gotten lost. The badges were a way to create a new identity, a legitimate identity. Not a performer, not an entertainer, but an officer, an agent, someone with real authority, someone who protected people instead of just entertaining them. Jerry Schilling, one of Elvis's closest friends, later said that the badge collection was Elvis's way of trying to feel important in a world that had reduced him to a caricature. The jumpsuits, the Vegas shows, the same songs over and over. Elvis felt like he had become a joke. But a badge? A badge was serious. A badge meant respect. A badge meant he was more than just a guy in a sequined outfit singing Hound Dog for the 1,000th time. And the federal badge from Nixon? That was the pinnacle. That was Elvis proving to himself and to everyone else that he was somebody, that he mattered. But the tragedy of the badge collection is that it didn't change anything. Elvis still felt empty. He still felt lost. He still felt out of control. Because the real problem wasn't a lack of badges. The real problem was the pills. And the pills were getting worse. By the mid-1970s, Elvis was taking so many prescription medications that his friends were terrified. They tried to talk to him. They tried to intervene. But Elvis wouldn't listen. He would pull out his federal badge and say, "I'm a federal agent. I know what I'm doing. These are prescribed by doctors. It's legal. It's medicine." The badge had become his shield, his excuse, his justification. If he was a federal narcotics agent, then he couldn't possibly have a drug problem. That would be absurd. That would be hypocritical. And Elvis couldn't face that kind of contradiction. You won't believe this, but the story gets even more ironic. In 1976, 6 years after meeting Nixon, Elvis was performing in Las Vegas, barely able to stand on stage. He was overweight, exhausted, slurring his words. His performances were becoming painful to watch. But backstage, he still carried his badge collection. He would show them to people, tell stories about meeting Nixon, talk about his authority as a federal agent. It was like the badges had become a fantasy, a delusion, a way to pretend that everything was okay, that he was still in control, that he still had power, when the reality was that Elvis had no control over anything, not his health, not his career, not his life. Priscilla Presley later said that the badge obsession was one of the saddest things about Elvis's final years, because it showed how desperate he was to be taken seriously, to be seen as more than just a performer. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to save people. He wanted to make a difference, but he couldn't even save himself. And the federal badge that he was so proud of, the badge that represented authority and control, became a symbol of the opposite, a symbol of denial, a symbol of how deeply Elvis had lost his way. Red West, one of Elvis's oldest friends and bodyguards, wrote in his memoir that he once confronted Elvis about the pills. This was in 1976, a year before Elvis died. Red said, "Elvis, you're killing yourself. You've got to stop." And Elvis, without missing a beat, pulled out his federal badge and said, "Red, I'm a federal agent. I know what drugs are. What I'm taking isn't drugs. It's medicine." Red stared at him speechless, because in that moment he realized that Elvis genuinely believed it. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't denial in the way most people experience denial. Elvis had convinced himself, at a fundamental level, that prescription pills were not drugs. And if they weren't drugs, then he didn't have a problem. And if he didn't have a problem, then he didn't need help. The logic was circular, insane. But to Elvis, it made perfect sense. And this is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. Because Elvis's badge collection, his meeting with Nixon, his federal agent badge, all of it was a desperate attempt to find meaning and purpose in a life that felt meaningless. He wanted to be more than just a singer. He wanted to be a protector, a hero, a force for good. And in his mind, the badges proved that he was. But the truth is, the badges proved nothing. They were just metal and enamel. They had no power, no authority, no meaning beyond what Elvis projected onto them. And in the end, they couldn't save him. Nothing could. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died in the bathroom at Graceland. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia. But the toxicology report told the real story. Elvis had 14 different drugs in his system at the time of his death. Codeine, morphine, Quaaludes, Valium, Demerol, and more. All prescribed, all legal, all taken as medicine. And somewhere in Graceland, in a display case, sat Elvis's badge collection, including the federal narcotics agent badge from President Nixon. The badge that was supposed to represent Elvis's commitment to fighting drug abuse. The badge that became the ultimate symbol of the tragic irony of his life. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. After Elvis died, his estate held onto the badge collection. It became part of the Graceland Museum, and tourists would walk through and see the badges on display, including the federal agent badge. And guides would tell the story of Elvis meeting Nixon. And people would laugh. They thought it was funny. Elvis Presley, the rock star, meeting Richard Nixon, the president. Two American icons. A strange, surreal moment in history. But what most people missed, what most people still miss, is the tragedy underneath. Because that badge wasn't a funny souvenir. It was a cry for help. It was Elvis trying to find purpose, trying to feel important, trying to be something more than what fame had made him. And it didn't work. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, hated the badge obsession. Not because he cared about Elvis's well-being, though he claimed he did, but because it distracted Elvis from making money. In 1971, Parker confronted Elvis about spending too much time visiting police departments and not enough time focusing on his career. Elvis's response was to pull out his federal badge and say, "Colonel, I'm a federal agent now. I have responsibilities beyond entertainment." Parker stared at him, speechless. Then he laughed, a cold, calculated laugh, and he said, "Elvis, you're not an agent. You're a performer, and that badge is a toy." Elvis never forgave him for that. The two men's relationship, already strained, deteriorated further, because Parker had touched the one thing Elvis held sacred, the belief that he was more than just a money-making machine. Dr. George Nicopolis, Elvis's personal physician, the man who prescribed most of the pills, later said in interviews that he didn't realize how bad things had gotten until it was too late. He said Elvis would justify every prescription by talking about his responsibilities, his fans, his family, his duty to perform. And sometimes, Elvis would show Dr. Nick his badges and say, "I'm an officer. I know what I'm doing." The badges had become part of Elvis's self-delusion, a prop in the story he told himself to make sense of his addiction. In 1973, 3 years after receiving the federal badge, Elvis was hospitalized for drug-related issues. Dr. Nick sat beside his bed and tried to talk to him about reducing his medication. Elvis listened quietly, then reached for his wallet on the bedside table. He pulled out the federal narcotics badge and held it up. "Doc, I appreciate your concern. But look at this. I'm a federal agent. I've studied drugs. I know what they do. What I'm taking is different. It's controlled. It's prescribed. It's medicine." Dr. Nick stared at the badge, then at Elvis, and realized there was nothing he could say. The badge had become a security blanket, a shield against reality. As long as Elvis had that badge, he could convince himself that everything was under control, even as his body was shutting down, even as his life was falling apart. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to this, because the final twist in the Elvis and Nixon story came decades later. In 1988, the National Archives released the official photograph of Elvis and Nixon's meeting. It became one of the most requested photographs in the National Archives, even more popular than photos of presidents and astronauts. People loved it. The absurdity of it. The Americana of it. Elvis in his cape and sunglasses. Nixon in his suit, looking awkward and confused. Two men from completely different worlds, shaking hands in the Oval Office. But when you look at that photograph knowing what happened to Elvis 7 years later, it stops being funny. It becomes tragic. Because in that photo, Elvis is smiling. He's proud. He's holding his federal badge like it's the greatest achievement of his life. And he has no idea that the very thing he's fighting against is the thing that will kill him. The story of Elvis and the badges is ultimately a story about control, or the illusion of control. Elvis spent his entire life trying to control something, anything, in a world that felt increasingly out of his grasp. His career was controlled by Colonel Parker. His image was controlled by Hollywood. His marriage was falling apart. His health was deteriorating. But the badges? The badges were his. Nobody could take them away. Nobody could tell him what they meant. They were proof that he had power, that he had authority, that he mattered. Except they weren't. They were just metal. And metal can't save you. Lisa Marie, Elvis's daughter, was 9 years old when she found her father's badge collection. It was 1977, just months before Elvis died. She was playing in his office at Graceland and opened a drawer filled with badges. Dozens of them. She picked one up, a gold federal narcotics badge, and ran to find her father. "Daddy, what are all these?" Elvis looked at the badge in her small hands, and for a moment, His face showed something Lisa Marie had never seen before. Shame. He took the badge gently and said, "These are reminders, sweetheart. Reminders of who I tried to be." Lisa Marie didn't understand. But years later, as an adult, she would look back on that moment and realize it was her father admitting, in the only way he could, that the badges hadn't worked, that trying to be someone else hadn't saved him. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, said years later that if he could go back and change one thing, it would be to take away the federal badge, to break the spell it had over Elvis, because that badge gave Elvis permission to keep taking pills. It gave him a way to rationalize his addiction. "I'm a federal agent. I know what drugs are. This isn't drugs." Without that badge, maybe, just maybe, Elvis would have had to face the truth. But with it, the truth was easier to ignore. Elvis Aaron Presley spent the last years of his life as a walking contradiction. A federal narcotics agent who was addicted to narcotics. A man who wanted to save America's youth from drugs while he himself was drowning in prescription medications. A performer who felt powerless, collecting badges to feel powerful. A legend who felt forgotten, trying to prove he still mattered. And in the end, none of it worked. The badges didn't save him. The authority didn't protect him. The delusion didn't hold. And on August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died the same way so many people with addiction die. Alone. Confused about what went wrong. Convinced until the very end that it was under control. The federal badge Elvis received from Nixon in 1970 is now on display at Graceland. Tourists take pictures with it. They read the plaque explaining the bizarre meeting. They smile and shake their heads at the absurdity of it all. But maybe we should look at that badge differently. Not as a funny historical artifact, but as a reminder. A reminder that addiction doesn't care about status. It doesn't care about fame. It doesn't care about federal badges or presidential handshakes. And it doesn't care if the drugs are legal or illegal. Addiction is addiction. And Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, died from it. While wearing his badge, while believing he had it under control. While thinking that authority and power could protect him from the thing that was killing him from the inside. So the next time you see that photograph of Elvis and Nixon, remember what it really represents. Not a funny moment in history. Not a weird crossover between rock and roll and politics. But a tragedy. A man so desperate for meaning, for control, for proof that he mattered, that he convinced himself a piece of metal could save him. And in doing so, he lost sight of the one thing that could have saved him. The truth. Tell us in the comments, have you ever faced a moment where you had to prove yourself or lose everything? What's the hardest comeback you've ever made? Do you think the pressure of fame is worth the glory? Let us know what city you're watching from today. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of Elvis Presley, the moments that tested him, and the performances that defined him. Hit the bell to never miss a story that matters.